5 classes, which all were F grades. There are other classes without grades, and I don't know what to make of that.
And it also doesn't have what he was as far as his GPA.
There's no GPA listed either.
Okay.
Whereas it's listed as 0.00, so effectively there's not a GPA there.
All right. And that record with the 5 Fs, that is the 9th grade, and that is the grade he dropped out of school, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
All right. If you go look at number 10 in evidence, this was another document received from Miss Brooks, is that correct?
Yes.
And can you read into the record the brief notation on that document?
On July 19, 2014, a records request signed by Mr. Toledo was sent to the New York Department of Education Records Management at 65 Court Street, room 1803, Brooklyn, New York, 11201. A response was received on October 12, 2014, indicating the department did not have any education records for Mr. Toledo. On December 10, 2015, a call was placed to the Walter J. Damrosch School, PS 186X, which was the last school that Mr. Toledo had attended in New York City. The receptionist disclosed that the basement, open parentheses, which provided storage for former students' records, close parentheses, had flooded 4 years ago, open parentheses, likely due to Hurricane Sandy, close parentheses, period. As a result, the records had been destroyed and were subsequently discarded by school staff.
All right, thank you. And I misspoke, it's Ms. Butler, not Ms. Brooks. All right, thank you, Doctor. Now, as far as historical school records for Mr. Toledo, that's all you had to look at, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Okay, in addition to the medical records we talked about.
I did.
All right, and without getting into that in any detail, is that a copy of a report that he generated as part of his work in the case?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay. Let me go back a little bit to some of these earlier records that you talked about, specifically some of these disorders that are noted in these records. You stated earlier that one of the records, or perhaps even more than one, but records from the Department of Corrections reference something in there called antisocial disorder. Remember that?
Antisocial personality disorder, yes.
Can you explain to the jury what that is?
Sure. In the system that we use to diagnose mental illnesses, it used to be 2 completely separate areas. One was called Axis 1 disorders, which are disorders that are considered to be treatable by medication and other methods. There are things that people are mostly familiar with, like depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, things like that. There are other disorders which were called personality disorders, which are basically character disorders that describe how a person reacts with the world consistently throughout their life. There's a bunch of different ones of those. There's people with dependent personality disorder, there's people with narcissistic personality disorder, there's several different ones, and one of them is called antisocial personality disorder. And basically what it refers to is a pervasive pattern of behavior throughout one's life in terms of how they interact with the world.
And through these are standardized definitions and so forth, right? This isn't a concept that you've developed.
It's part of the primary manual that we use is called the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. We're in the 5th edition now. And the diagnostic criteria are set out in the manual as to what you need to diagnose these conditions.
All right, and in your experience and training in this field of occupation, do a large number of people fit within that of prison populations as it relates to antisocial personality disorder?
Yes.
And from your review and your understanding, what is roughly the percentage of inmates in prison right now today that have that disorder?
Overall, it varies across studies, but generally speaking, its approach is 50%.
And so the population of people in prison, that particular disorder is not uncommon at all, it sounds like.
It's very prevalent.
Now, when you talked to Mr. Toledo, you discussed some of his personal life, I'm assuming, correct?
Yes.
And just briefly, do you know from your work in the case if either his mother or his father are alive today?
I believe they're both deceased.
And is it your understanding that his father died at a young age from what's called ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease?
Yes, that's what he had told me.
And his mother also died young of a heart attack? Is that? Now, did you have a chance to get any information about Mr. Toledo's employment history?
Yes, primarily from him, since I don't recall having specific employment records.
Did you make a sample list of some jobs that he's had over the years?
Yes.
Tell us what you found out.
Sure, just a moment. He basically worked a variety of manual labor jobs, such as masonry, carpentry, telemarketing, collections, fast food, and other things. He told me that at the time he was arrested, he had been recently hired by a collection agency, but was still in training.
Okay. And has he in the past been able to hold a job for at least 2 or 3 years at a time?
That's what he told me, up to 3 years.
And do you know from your work in the case if prior to his marriage to Miss Yesenia Suarez, he had a prior marriage?
Yes, well, I know what he told me, which is that he was married for 11 years and had one daughter from that marriage.
His daughter's name is Sage?
I don't recall, but yes.
All right. And do you dispute that she's roughly or 16 years old at this time?
I honestly don't know.
Okay. All right. In addition to the head injuries that we've been able to discuss by records, did you also learn of some other closed head injuries that Mr. Toledo suffered in 1997 as a result of an automobile accident?
Yes, based upon what he told me.
And what is your understanding? What injuries did he sustain?
What he told me was that he suffered injuries to his lower back and believes he had a concussion. He recalled that he thought he was in the ICU for about 4 days and was discharged shortly thereafter, which he said was due to a lack of insurance. I have no idea how long he would have been unconscious or the extent of it because I don't have the records.
Okay. And was there any reported lingering effects from that head injury?
He told me that initially he was having difficulty with memory and concentration, but that improved over time. That would be consistent with one would expect from a mild concussion.
All right. Did it ever get discussed in your work in the case about something where on certain occasions Lewis was known to have self-injured or cut himself on purpose?
He told me that, yes.
What's your understanding of that concept in general, people that self-injure themselves?
It's fairly common in psychiatric illness. It's common in people Sometimes it's an outright suicide attempt, and sometimes it is described by patients as a way to calm down.
The cutting.
Yeah, the cutting, right. I've seen it hundreds of times over my career, of various severities. It happens in people with depression. It happens in people with other illnesses like bipolar disorder. It happens in people who have certain personality disorders, particularly one called borderline personality disorder. So it happens in a variety of different conditions, but it certainly is not uncommon.
What's your understanding, sir, why, what is the relief that these people get from cutting themselves?
It's hard to understand. It's hard to comprehend for somebody who doesn't have that tendency. I can only tell you what people have told me over the years, patients as well as forensic clients, is that it is a way of feeling as if they're alive, the pain. It's a way of calming down when they're upset. And sometimes it's actually a suicide attempt, but many times it's not a suicide attempt.
Is that cutting behavior in his case consistent with these other records that you've reviewed and his mental health condition overall?
Well, apparently he has a history of cutting himself in a suicide attempt.
Did you and him discuss the attempted suicide that happened in the days shortly after the arrest in this case?
Only briefly. We discussed the fact that he had, in a bathroom, attempted to kill himself by cutting himself shortly after arrest.
And would that be distinguished from these other instances of maybe less severe or more superficial cutting? Or can you?
Well, he described it to me as a suicide attempt, so yes.
The time in October 2013.
Correct.
How about Mr. Toledo and the use of street drugs? Any reporting of that?
No, he told me that he never did particularly like alcohol or other drugs. Drank alcohol occasionally, was never into street drugs. In the records that I reviewed, I don't recall coming across any diagnoses that had to do with substance abuse, so that supports that contention.
All right, doctor. Now, let me kind of flip the page here. Concentrate not on the historical part of his life so much as some of the work that you've done more recently here. Now, when you met with him, how did he present to you? What were some of your initial observations?
He was well groomed. He was calm. He was completely cooperative with me. I do this with all kinds of defendants every day, so I get all kinds of interactions with them. But in his particular case, he was completely cooperative. I didn't have any problem with him being irritable or oppositional or manipulative, trying to control the conversation, that kind of stuff. He was just cooperative with the questions I asked him and cooperative with the test procedures I did.
Okay, and this is done at the Volusia County Jail?
Correct.
All right, and as part of what you did when you were with him, put him through a series of mental health tests?
Yeah, neuropsychological tests. As I mentioned previously when you asked me about my education, I was trained primarily as a neuropsychologist, which is an area of specialization of looking at various types of cognitive abilities and their association with different disorders, brain injuries, developmental disorders, things like that. So I did a variety of cognitive tests with him. That's what I focused on in terms of the formal testing.
All right, now these formal cognitive tests, are these something special for Louis Toledo, or are these standardized tests that are used throughout your industry?
They're standardized tests. In my doing forensic work, I use measures that I'm confident have been used for many years and are widely accepted in practice. The measures that I use are common neuropsychological tests that are familiar to most any clinician who does this kind of work.
How many patients, doctor, do you believe you've administered these series of tests to over the years?
Hundreds to thousands.
And I'm assuming you've had a lot of training and continuing education in reference to these tests?
Correct. It was neuropsychology is the area I did my dissertation research for my PhD, so I'm very familiar with it.
All right, sir. Now, these tests, these series of standardized tests, what are they designed to do? What are they supposed to tell you?
Different aspects of a person's cognitive thinking abilities. Basically, what I do is I start out with the most widely used IQ test called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And it's on the 4th edition. And it gives me a general picture of their overall intellect, and also is made up of 10 different subtests, so you look at relations between how they do on various different subtests for strengths and weaknesses. And then I typically follow that up with a test of memory called the Wechsler Memory Scale, 4th edition, again, one of the most widely used clinical measures of memory in practice. And that does the same thing. It looks at verbal and nonverbal kinds of memory abilities.
All right. We're going to talk a little bit more detail about those. How long does it take for you to administer these tests to a patient?
It depends. It's a number of hours.
All right. So let's go through some of these test results that you found in the case against Mr. Toledo. And you've mentioned these in your report, starting, I guess, on page 5 and 6. Is that right?
Correct.
All right, doctor. Tell us, for the first couple tests here, what is it that you're looking for? What are you testing for?
First thing I did is the IQ test, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, 4th edition. I'm looking at their general intellect, their IQ, what's called full-scale IQ, and then I'm looking at their performance on the various clusters of subtests that make up that measure. As I said, it's made up of 10 different kinds of subtests that measure verbal abilities, nonverbal abilities, speed of information processing, working memory, and things like that. So,
all right. So let me make sure I understand this. To get someone's overall IQ, in your work, you developed that by giving a series of tests to come up with that final number, correct?
Correct. You come up with the scores on each one, and then they are compared to norms, and then they are put into indices for the different groups.
All right, and of the tests that you do to make the final conclusion of someone's IQ, what's the first one that you gave to them?
The first test on there?
Yeah.
I didn't break down the individual test in my report. I broke down the indices, but I can go through the individual.
Well, that's what I'm interested in, these indices.
Okay. The indexes are not necessarily in order of the administration of the test, but it's in the order that you score them. So the first one is called the Verbal Comprehension Index.
All right, that's where in your report it's the letters
VCI.
VCI. Okay, so
Correct.
we'll use that as the order. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, what is that VCI test supposed to find out?
Somebody's verbal reasoning abilities and knowledge, things that they should have learned in life experiences in school, and their ability to solve problems verbally.
Right. How did he do on that test, sir?
His was an 81, which is at the very low end of what's called the low average range. Just one moment. Go ahead.
So if all the IQ testing stopped right there, or is that what you're saying? He'd be an IQ of 81?
Well, his verbal IQ is 80.
His verbal.
Right.
All right, and you said that is in the low average range, correct?
It's the bottom end of the low average range. It's
What percentage of his peers would he be above?
I'm looking at the percentile scores right now. Trying to find it in this. I didn't put it in there, but it's about the 10th percentile.
So 100 is you're like up there with the best, and his is so low. There's only
Well, if the way to think about it is if you picked 100 people at random and lined them up from best to worst on that particular measure, he'll be in the bottom 10.
Okay, 10 or less.
Yes.
All right. Now he doesn't do as poorly on these other tests, correct?
That is quite correct.
All right. So going down your list here, what's the PRI stand for?
Perceptual Reasoning Index. It's the nonverbal equivalent of the type of tests that are in the verbal index. It's for it's like puzzles and nonverbal reasoning stuff that doesn't involve language. It's more what's considered to be right hemisphere kinds of tasks. And he did quite well on that. He had a standard score of 109, which is at the 73rd percentile. So if 50 is at average, he's at the 73rd, so he is above approximately a little over 70% of the population in that particular ability.
All right, and what's the WMI?
That's working memory index, and that means how much information you can hold in your memory for brief periods of time. His performance on that was 100, which is right at average. That's the 50th percentile.
Okay, what's the PSI?
Processing speed index, that's a measure of how fast you can process information. And again, it was a little bit above average. His score was 108, which is at the 70th percentile. So he's, if you line the people up, he's about the 70th one in the line towards the highest.
All right, and so from those sub-tests, were you able to determine what his IQ score is?
His full-scale IQ score is a 98, which is almost at average. 100 would be right in the middle. It's about the 45th percentile. But in this particular manifestation of scores, that's a little misleading because there's such a big difference between his verbal and nonverbal abilities that, oftentimes when you do these various indices, the scores are all relatively similar. And so the full-scale IQ is a pretty good, clear picture of the person's overall IQ abilities. In a case like this, where there's such a dramatic difference, I think about 28 points between his verbal and nonverbal abilities, it's not as meaningful. But bottom line is, the full-scale IQ score is 98. It's in the average range, almost right at average. But it doesn't show you the difference in scores that I just described to you.
All right, and what is the score of an IQ for someone who's clinically or medically considered mentally retarded?
That's below 70.
Below 70? Mm-hmm. And what is a score of a super genius type of an IQ? What would they be getting?
I don't know, there's that term, but, it's generally the higher ones are 120 and above.
Do you have any way to explain the very poor score, that less than 10% in that verbal test?
Well, I can tell you that, as I said, there's variability in everybody. But that level of difference between verbal and nonverbal is found in only about 2% of the population, okay? So only about 2% of the people have that much of a difference. I cannot tell you with certainty where it comes from. I can say that it could come from the neurological condition, which is well documented in the seizure disorder. It could come from a variety of different things. I can only tell you that it's a dramatic difference. It's not something you usually see.
Is that a type of a spread you see a lot in your practice?
No, it's like I said, it's only about 2% of the population has that big of a difference.
All right, sir. Now, you have on page 7 a graph with some following information. Is this a second series of tests that you...
Yeah, this is the memory index I mentioned, the Wechsler memory scale, 4th edition, and it's very similar to the IQ in the sense that it's broken up into verbal and nonverbal kinds of tasks. The pattern's the same. If you look at the auditory memory, which depends upon verbal language, it's an 87, which, if you remember, his verbal comprehension was an 81, so it's in the same ballpark.
That would be low average?
Yeah, it's lower average, about the 19th percentile.
Okay.
His visual memory, which is comparable to what I told you about the nonverbal reasoning stuff, is 103. And if you remember, the perceptual reasoning was 109, so it's very similar. So there's the same pattern. So what suggests is that what you see in terms of the verbal reasoning is the same thing that you see in terms of the verbal memory, and likewise for the nonverbal. It's the same pattern.
Are these tests just sort of like a backup or a way to confirm the other tests that we've been talking about?
No, they're different because the memory test is specifically that. It's a measure of memory. The IQ test does not use any kind of memory apart, well, long-term memory, things you should have learned, but it's not like testing what I show you now and can you remember it. So it's a different type of cognitive ability, but it's in the same pattern of different types of tasks, and his difference was very, very similar across both of those tasks.
All right. What about the visual working memory?
Again, that was a 94. That's similar to what I described to you in the IQ test, where it was 100 in those tasks. So it's very similar. His immediate memory, which is averaging the memory of the verbal and nonverbal, was a 98, which is doesn't reflect the difference between those two. It's just when you put them both together, immediately that's where he falls. So it's about average for that, and that's clinically that score exists because his nonverbal is above average and his verbal is below average. So when they come together, they get to be about average.
What's the delayed memory test?
Delayed is when you basically, the memory tests are done where you give them a task, they do it immediately, and then you do some other things, and then they have to do it again later on, and you see how well they retain the information. And that was a 90. And so it stands right in the average range, just low end of the average range, but it's, again, it's going to be reflective of the sort of the averaging of those two types of abilities.
All right, sir. Now, those series of tests, that doesn't change the earlier testimony about his IQ score, right?
No.
Okay. Now, when you did the Wechsler individual achievement test, when it came to oral language,
Correct.
what happened there? What were your findings?
His language comprehension, meaning his ability to understand what is said to him verbally, is about the level of a 15-year-old adolescent, mid-teenage years. Probably about the same level that you might expect based upon the limited verbal abilities, considering he's a full-grown adult now. I do that test for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons I do that test one of the things I address is whether a person is competent to proceed, and I want to know whether they're understanding things well enough to be able to process the information given to them. And his score was a mid-adolescent, but it was sufficient for my purposes of addressing the relevance to competency.
Okay, so he's a grown man in his...
He's a grown man with an oral language comprehension of about a 15-year-old.
And he's in his 30s.
Correct.
What is the verbal fluency test?
It's a test of what's referred to as like frontal lobe abilities, and what that means is the ability to maintain concentration and to change conceptual sets as one does a task. It's sensitive to problems what people have with like frontal lobe disorders, where the frontal lobes get damaged and they can't maintain a set, or they can't concentrate. Same thing with the next thing I did, Trails A and B. They're both similar kinds of tasks. They were both within the non-impaired range.
Those tests were average range, correct?
Yeah, it's not like the IQ test where you have a whole, bell curve of distribution of scores that you look at standard scores, but clinically they were within the non-impaired range, in my opinion. They didn't concern me.
All right. Now, you had earlier in your testimony mentioned this term in your business called malingering, and you told us right there what it is. Tell us again what it is, and then tell us if there's a test you can do to see if someone's doing this while you're working with them.
Sure. Malingering is either the exaggeration or the fabrication of symptoms for the purposes of some sort of manipulation, okay? When you're doing cognitive testing like I was doing it, it refers to somebody who is intentionally trying to do badly, okay, to manipulate the results. There's several ways you can look at it. But when I do formal testing like this, I like to use this test called the test of memory malingering because it appears to be a very difficult test to the person who's receiving it, but it's actually quite simple because it's just recognition memory. It's not something that you have to recall. You just have to recognize what you've seen before. And essentially, by the second trial, which is the only one that you score on this, his was perfect. And the power of this test is that it's one of the few tests that you give people that during the test, you give them feedback about how they're doing, whether something's right or wrong. And so they can monitor how well they're doing. So someone who is inclined to try to do badly can keep sort of an idea in their head how they're doing and manipulate the results to do badly. He got a perfect score. So that was, in my opinion, consistent with my clinical impression that he was cooperative with my evaluation process.
All right, sir. So kind of review some of these tests. His overall IQ is 98.
Correct.
There's certain ways of learning that he's very bad at, but most of these he's falling within normal ranges. Is that correct?
There's a very significant difference between his verbal and nonverbal abilities. His verbal abilities are way down at the cusp of between low average to borderline. His nonverbal abilities are at the cusp of between average and high average. So there's a very large difference that is usually evident in only about 2% of the population, regardless of what the cause of it is.
All right. And you've concluded that, in your opinion, based on your training and experience, he was not malingering when he was with you, correct?
Yeah, I saw no evidence of that. And usually, quite frankly, if somebody was doing that, they would have done a lot worse on many of these measures than he did.
And you yourself have told us earlier that you don't have a hesitancy to make that conclusion if you feel that's what's been going on to you, correct?
Correct. I do evaluations for the court system every day, all day, and I catch people malingering every single week.
Now, let me ask you some other questions here, sir. Based on your testing and the results that you had, is Louis Toledo legally competent?
Yes, I did a structured competency interview because obviously in a case like this is one of the things you want to make absolutely certain of. And legally that means that they understand the appropriate concepts and roles in the legal system, and that they are coherent and stable enough to participate actively in their defense. And in my opinion, that is true. I believe he's competent to proceed. I have no concern about that.
All right, but being competent does not mean that you don't have mental health problems.
Correct. It means it does not rise to the level that would leave you unable to participate in your defense.
All right, so let me discuss some of your findings and conclusions based on the historical records and the other information you received. What would you say about the neuropsychological evaluation and his severe mental deficits with that split and so forth?
I want to be clear, his deficits are not in a severely impaired range, but his cognitive abilities, his scatter of cognitive abilities is very unusual. And the cause of it is hard to say with absolute certainty. He does have a documented seizure disorder. I don't know, because there were not sufficient records, I don't know exactly where the seizures were originating in his brain. And I don't know for certain what caused the seizure disorder. I do know that it is documented to exist from at least 3 years of age. He has had some reported concussions during his life. Again, I don't have great records available for that. And so I can't say for certain what caused the difference I saw, but the difference I saw in his abilities was large, and I believe was reflective of some sort of neurological abnormality, which is supported by the idea that he has a very well-documented seizure disorder. And seizure disorders don't just exist for no reason, they exist for some Developmentally, I don't have any specific information about the pregnancy or the birth from the parents because they are deceased. There is a possibility that it was birth-related trauma. There is a possibility that it was the result of some concussions. There's a possibility that it's a result of something we don't know, that I can't put my finger on. All I know is he has unusual neuropsychological test scatter, and he has a seizure disorder. So from that perspective, diagnostically, I think that the appropriate diagnosis is what is called a minor neurocognitive disorder. And what that means is somebody whose presentation suggests that there's cognitive issues, but it's not so severe as to render them not functional in daily life, okay? Because he's maintained employment, he's had marriages, he's lived independently. It's not the kind of person who is so impaired that they are incapable of doing those things. But it is an unusual manifestation of cognitive abilities.
Is it consistent with your review of the historical records in conjunction with your test results that his life arc is consistent with people that do have brain abnormalities?
I'm sorry, can you say that again for me?
From reviewing the historical records and your own testing and all the results, from what you've learned, is his history consistent with people who have brain abnormalities?
Yes, I mean, seizure disorder is clearly a brain abnormality. That's not a question.
And this is a clear, documented disorder going all the way back to early childhood, correct?
Yes, it's in the medical records, dating back to, those childhood records that referred to long before we got anywhere near where we are today, that referred to the mother saying he'd had a seizure disorder since 3 years of age.
All right. And in October 2013, was Louis Toledo insane, walking around insane person?
No. The legal concept of insanity requires that someone is so impaired that they lack the capacity to understand the nature, consequences, or wrongfulness of their actions. And there is no indication to me that that would be the case.
All right, and sir, based on your training and experience, all the work you've done in this case and all the records that you reviewed, do you have an opinion in a reasonable degree of medical certainty on whether Mr. Toledo's capacity to conform his behavior to the constraints of the law were substantially impaired on October 22nd and early mornings of October 23rd?
I believe they were impaired, and I'll describe to you why that is. He has a history, as well as we can determine from both the limited school records we do have, as well as the references to the educational placement in the medical records that I reviewed about, when he got basically attacked by the teacher, and they report that he'd been in special education throughout school, that he has had severe emotional problems dating back to early childhood. We have medical records which show that he has been treated aggressively and repeatedly for psychiatric illness throughout his life in the Department of Corrections for many years with various medications, including antipsychotic medications, mood-stabilizing medications, and antidepressant medications. He has a history of self-harm repeatedly by cutting and I think probably other means. He's basically been emotionally unstable. If you look at these records, he's been emotionally unstable since he was a child. That kind of condition is one that would impair a person's capacity to conform their behavior. And as far as I know, he was not receiving psychiatric care at the time of the incident resulting in these charges. So that's why I believe that to be true.
That's not something you would state in a courtroom lightly, correct?
Correct. We have a lot of records in this particular case.
Do you believe that Mr. Toledo would be in need of future psychiatric care based on what you've reviewed?
Yes. In fact, he is, one thing we may not have discussed is he is under psychiatric, from what he told me anyway, He is under psychiatric care at this time, receiving Wellbutrin, an antidepressant. He had, and I can't remember, we've gone through a lot of things, I can't remember if we discussed this particularly, but he had been treated in the jail after this with some psychiatric medications that had become non-compliant at some point in time. And when I saw him for my original evaluation, he was off medicine at that time. But from what he told me when I went back to see him last week, he is back on Wellbutrin, which is an antidepressant medication. So yeah, apart from all the other issues in this, it appears clear from the DOC records and from the jail records and everything that he is in need of psychiatric care.
All right, and your diagnostic opinion is that he's got minor neurocognitive disorder, unspecified, he's got bipolar disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, correct?
By history, yes.
All right, now why, in your report, do you not mention that other disorder, or maybe even some of the, there was quite a few, but you don't list every single one that, like, for example, that the DOC records had.
Right.
Why would you not be able to make a certain diagnosis based on?
Well, there's several of them, as you mentioned. They had mentioned him, they had described him as showing psychotic symptoms at points in time and described and attributed to a major depression with psychosis. That is a current condition. That's something you diagnose based upon a person's condition at that time. When I interacted with him and looking at the records, he wasn't psychotic when I interacted with him. I didn't see any evidence of that whatsoever. Now, it's entirely possible, and it appears from the records, that he has had episodes that were psychotic, but that can happen as, when people think about people who are psychotic, they mostly think about people with schizophrenia, because that's the most widely known psychotic condition and it's chronic. But psychotic episodes can happen with people who have bipolar disorder when they're in a manic episode and they become floridly psychotic. And they can also happen in people with severe depression who develop psychotic features. And once you treat those conditions, or in the case of bipolar disorder, you cycle out of it, potentially, the psychosis remits. So when I looked at the totality of his records and what they'd done and what they treated him with and what they described as symptoms, I thought it was most likely bipolar disorder and that he at times had psychotic features associated with the bipolar disorder. The other thing that they mentioned was antisocial personality disorder. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. The reason I didn't put it as a diagnosis is to formally diagnose it, you are supposed to have definitive evidence of what's called conduct disorder as a child, meaning that the person had a history of similar types of symptoms dating back to childhood, and that their symptoms of antisocial personality disorder sort of grew from that, and by 15 years of age they're still doing the same things and they get antisocial personality disorder diagnosis at that point in time as an adult. I'm not saying he doesn't have it, and I'm not saying that I disagree with the diagnosis. I'm just saying that I didn't have, if you're going to go by the formal diagnostic criteria, I didn't have the information about childhood stuff enough to convince me that it was there during childhood, but it may well have been. It's just lack of records. And as I said, in the prison population, and he's been, in prison before, the estimates vary, but about half of the people in there reportedly meet that criteria, so it wouldn't be unusual. So I'm not disputing it. I just didn't feel comfortable I had the information to make the diagnosis myself.
All right. Judge, I don't have any other questions of Dr. Mings.
All right, any cross-examination?
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Now, when you first began to testify, you were talking about initially about, you sort of defined kind of what forensic psychology is, and that's distinct from the field of clinical psychology, correct?
It's a subfield.
Okay. And forensic, as you, I believe, gave the definition, forensic psychology is the application of the law or psychology to the law. in this particular case in the criminal realm, correct?
Yes, I agree.
And in the clinical setting, you have somebody who thinks that they may have some problems. They go see a psychologist and see if they actually do have the problems and be treated, correct?
Correct.
Or somebody refers them to someone that they think has a problem, correct?
Yeah, I agree.
In the criminal setting, these come up generally with defendants who are in trouble, correct?
Yes, in the criminal system, they've got charges against them universally.
Right. Okay. It's obvious, correct?
Yes.
It's true that in that setting there is a high motivation to malinger, correct?
And yeah, and many people that may well be the case. It's something that I always consider in every evaluation because of the nature of the circumstances you're describing.
And in this particular case, with the records that you have reviewed in the past, there was evidence of the defendant malingering. Isn't that correct? There
is a record I reviewed that I was not asked about in direct, which I believe is what you're referring to, from North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center. Is that what we're talking about?
One of them.
Yes.
There were multiple indications that of other mental health professionals who had evaluated the defendant at various times that found that the defendant had been malingering with regard to a criminal case, correct?
I'm not sure. The one that I was provided with was a state hospital report from North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center where I used to work. I'm familiar with that report.
Did you receive a competency evaluation that was dated October the 18th of 2013 that was prepared by a Dr. Patsy Ceros Livingston? That's C-E-R-O-S Livingston.
Not to my recollection.
No, you did not. Now, you were aware that the defendant a number of years ago, back in 1999 to 2004 range, had a charge of robbery among some other charges. Were you not?
This is the charges that sent him to the state hospital?
These are the charges that sent him to prison.
Right, I know, ultimately to prison, but I think also to the state hospital.
Right, and there were some competency evaluations done in that case, correct?
Yes, I didn't have those. What I had was a state hospital report.
Okay. And were you aware that Dr. Livingston found that when she performed her competency evaluation that, now the defendant at that time was known as Michael Garcia.
Yeah, that's the state hospital report that I had referred to him as Michael Garcia. That's correct.
But we're still talking about the defendant, as you understand, correct?
I believe that's true, yes.
All right. And were you aware that when she conducted her her competency evaluation, that she indicated that Mr. Garcia may have been acting as he was able to come forth with some data regarding his medications? However, he seemed unwilling to answer the competency questions, although he seemed to understand questions about him in other areas.
Give me just a moment.
You have that report?
I don't believe I do. I was looking at the state hospital report to see if it was referenced. Because the reason I said that is because in the state hospital report, there was a reference when he was sent there to community evaluators who suggested testing in order to rule out symptom magnification and exaggeration. So that may be what you're talking about. Right. I don't have the original report, though. No.
And we'll get to that report in just a minute.
Okay.
But you don't recall ever receiving any records from the defense in this case from Dr. Livingston in October 2013 that said that when she conducted a competency evaluation that the defendant was acting?
Not to my recollection, no.
Did you receive a competency report from a Dr. Gina Delgardo, D-E-L-G-A-R-D-O, that was dated October the 19th of 2003?
Give me just a moment. I don't believe so.
So you were not aware that Dr. Delgardo reported to the court that he had been brought to the facility to see her with antipsychotic medications, and possible malingering.
When you say to the facility, where are we talking about?
The jail.
Oh, no, I don't believe I have that report.
Now, you mentioned as well that he had been, throughout his life, the defendant had been placed in special education classes. Is that correct?
As well as I can determine from the records I have.
Okay. Now, isn't it true that oftentimes people with behavioral problems, like emotional problems, maybe how you phrased it, are also placed in those types of classes?
Yes.
And were you aware that the defendant reported to Dr. Delgado in 2003 that he was placed in a special school because, quote, I was too bad?
I have no idea. As I said, I haven't seen the report.
You did not know that?
I haven't seen the report.
You were not provided with that report?
As far as I know.
So let's talk about the report that you said you did have, which I believe you said was from the North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center.
Yes, I do.
And who prepared that report?
Pulling it up in front of me. Well, second. The version that I have is unsigned, but the names that are on it are the type names where you would normally sign is Sally Miller, Counseling and Social Services Supervisor, Roger Davis, PhD, Staff Psychologist, and James Yelton, MD, Staff Psychiatrist. I don't know who actually prepared the report, but those are the names that on the signature lines.
Now, what is the North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center? What is that?
It's a forensic hospital. It's where I mentioned that I did part of my internship when I was at the VA hospital in Gainesville, and then I was subsequently hired as a staff psychologist there, where I worked for a short time before I accepted a job at the brain injury unit at ORMC. It's a forensic hospital where people are sent as either not competent to proceed or not guilty by reason of insanity.
Okay. And in this particular case, the defendant had been sent there for competency restoration training. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
All right. Because he had presented as incompetent in that particular case, right?
I only know what it says, and I can read the paragraph if you wish about why he ended up there.
Well, he was found incompetent, right, by the court?
Yes, I presume so, right. I mean, that's how you get there. So, yes, obviously, that was the finding.
Because he had presented himself that way to some doctors, and they were convinced, and the court found him incompetent based on that, and he was sent to this facility to be restored to competency.
Yes. I don't know how many doctors he saw or what the various findings were, but he was obviously sent to the facility as incompetent to proceed.
Now, isn't it true that in that report, now the report that you've been referring to, this was a report that the North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center sent back to the court, the judge in that particular case. Is that right?
Yes, that's what's usually done. Yes.
Judge Shapiro?
Yes.
And when that report was sent back to the judge, I guess the treatment team or the doctor or whoever prepared the report recommended to the court that the defendant undergo a neuropsychological evaluation with personality testing, including projective personality instruments, in order to rule out system magnification and exaggeration of mental illness to appear incompetent. Is that right?
Give me just a moment.
We'll take a look at page 2.
Right. I'm just.
Second paragraph.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. It appears to me that recommendation was made by one of the community evaluators when he was sent. I don't believe it was made by the state hospital. It's in the section where they're talking about the court-appointed evaluators that evaluated him before he got there. And I believe that that is the recommendation of at least one of the evaluators.
Okay, but basically what they're saying here is that in order to rule out possible malingering, that a neuropsychological evaluation with personality testing needed to be done. That was the recommendation, correct?
Well, they also...
Well, I just need you to answer my question.
That is correct.
And they also reported in the section entitled Course of Evaluation and Treatment that results from a psychological evaluation performed on the defendant indicated that he was malingering, correct?
That's what it says. There's no details, but that's what it says, yes.
Well, they say right underneath that, do they not, that evidence in support of this opinion included test results, the defendant's description of atypical psychological symptoms, and his vague and inconsistent account of symptoms, correct?
Correct. That is exactly right.
Now, in this particular case, somebody with the North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center was recommending personality testing. That was one of the things they thought was important to rule out the malingering. I know that you had testified today about conducting an IQ test and some memory tests. Did you perform any personality testing of the defendant in this case?
I don't believe your rendition of it is correct. I believe that statement was made by a community evaluator. I don't believe that was part of the recommendations of the state hospital report.
You say you believe, you don't know for sure.
Well, it's in the paragraph where they're describing the community evaluator assessments before he came to the state hospital. So logically, that seems to be what it is.
Okay. But those are mental health professionals, correct?
I presume. I don't know who they were, but yes.
And that was their recommendation, correct?
That was someone's recommendation, yes.
Okay. And you, in this case, did not perform any personality testing, correct?
No, because I really don't believe that it would have been relevant for what I was looking at, and I don't believe that it would have answered the question of malingering of symptoms. See, if I may explain, when I evaluated him, he was not claiming psychiatric symptoms. He was not claiming hallucinations. He was not claiming delusions. He was not claiming disorientation. He was not claiming that he didn't know what was going on in the court system. He wasn't claiming any of those things. And that's what you might want to do with personality testing and some malingering measures that are specific for fabrication of psychiatric symptoms. But the fact of the matter is, he didn't claim any of those things when I interacted with him.
There was indication, though, that he had been diagnosed previously with antisocial personality disorder, which is a personality disorder, correct?
Yes, and I said I do not necessarily disagree with that.
Okay. That's one of the things that could explain previous incidents of malingering, correct?
It's a factor.
In fact, in that same report, the North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center, when it produced its diagnosis in the case, you were referring to the different axes that mental health professionals will make diagnosis for. Their axis 1 diagnosis was malingering, is that correct?
And rule out psychotic disorder not otherwise specified.
Right, but their axis 1, it basically is malingering.
It was both of those things. They're both on axis 1 listed as diagnoses.
Now, a lot of the things that we talked about today, head injuries, things of that nature, those were self-reported by the defendant, is that correct?
The actual head injuries were self-reported. The seizure disorder that I mentioned was clearly documented in the medical records, but I didn't have any records of actual head injuries. I agree.
Okay, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. I don't necessarily know that I dispute the seizure disorder. But with regard to the reports of head injuries, there was no medical documentation of any brain injury or any internal head injury with regard to the defendant. Is that correct?
Not to my knowledge, no.
All of that came from the defendant himself.
Correct.
And in that same report, again by the North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center, those things were discussed, and they reported that he had not exhibited any noticeable cognitive deficits at their facility, correct?
Give me just a moment. Yes, I believe you're correct. Yes, I believe you're correct. Yes, I said yes, I believe you're correct.
Thank you. Did you receive a competency evaluation report from a doctor by the name of Martin Siegel, dated August 30th of 2002?
No.
You were not aware that he also made findings of malingering with regard to the defendant in that case?
No, I was not aware of either of the evaluators who had seen, let me rephrase that. I knew there were evaluators who had seen him before he went to the state hospital. I did not have the reports.
Were you aware that Dr. Siegel found that the defendant had a history of antisocial behavior beginning in middle school and was expelled from several schools?
No. I have not seen that report.
If you had received any of these reports, would you have factored those into your decision?
I would consider anything I received.
So just to be clear, when we talk about the hospitalizations that you've testified about, you talked about the one in August of 1992 where the defendant fell off his bike and injured his knee. You found that there was nothing significant that assisted you
No, not
in making your conclusions in this case?
Correct. In that one, I didn't find anything of value to assist me.
And with regard to the hospitalization in July of 1993, where the defendant was hit in the right eye with the ball, wasn't it true that there was no evidence of any injury in that particular case?
To the eye is what it said.
To the eye, yes. I'm not sure if I said something different, but to the...
Well, you said any injury, and I said any injury to the eye.
There was no injury to the eye, correct?
Right.
And there's no evidence of any brain injury in that case?
Well, he was brought there because he was having a seizure, reportedly by the mother. That's why she brought him to the hospital. And he was noted to have a history of seizure disorder.
And with regard to the incident in September of 1994, where he fell off the bike and was discharged, you again found there was no significance to that?
No, not to me.
And particular incident?
No, there's no reason for me to believe that.
Okay. Gave no indication that there was any head injury, brain injury with regard to the defendant as a result of this incident?
Yes, I agree with you, yes.
So all of the, we talked a great deal about a lot of the diagnoses that have been in his history.
Yes.
Almost all of those, are they not? Other than, let's put aside the seizure disorder, but when it comes to psychological or mental disorders, all of those that you have reviewed and the records that you have received and when the defendant was incarcerated. Is that correct?
No, not correct.
Okay. What
The records, the early medical records, when they reference him being treated for and evaluated at Mount Sinai Hospital by psychiatric services, reference a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is usually the first diagnosis you get with mental illness as a small child, regardless of what happens later on. So there was definitely that diagnosis that happened during childhood.
Okay, but that was it. I mean, hyperactivity and attention deficit disorder, that was it.
That's the only diagnosis that was contained there, I agree.
And nothing until he went to prison.
The only other records I have were from prison, that's correct.
And again, as you indicated, there is a high motivation to malinger symptoms, correct?
There can be, yes.
When someone's in the criminal setting.
There can be. I mean, you know, a certain percentage of people that I see are malingering, a certain percentage of people that I see are being cooperative, but there certainly is potentially motivation in the criminal system. I have no doubt about that.
Now, isn't it also true, Dr. Mings, that that it's fairly common when individuals are incarcerated, whether it's a county jail or whether it's a prison, that they are oftentimes prescribed medications to basically control their behavior? Is that correct?
They should not be prescribed medications unless they have a diagnosable reason to have them. You can't just, unless you are in an acute setting where somebody's out of control and you're trying to sedate them. It's an ethical issue to prescribe a medication to an individual unless you have a medical condition that you're prescribing it for.
Okay, like depression it would be a diagnosable condition. And I think a lot of the medications that you indicated that the defendant, there was a history of him being prescribed were antidepressants, correct?
Yeah, that was one class of them, yes.
Now, you indicated, I think in your conclusions, that one of the things that you diagnosed the defendant as having was bipolar disorder. Is that correct?
Correct.
What are the symptoms of bipolar disorder?
Bipolar disorder is a cyclical disorder that tends to have a combination of episodes of mania and depression. During episodes of mania, people usually get hyperactive. They don't sleep. They may do really impulsive things. They may be aggressive. They may at times actually exhibit full-blown psychotic symptoms. They have poor judgment. They have impulsivity. And they're, in simple terms, extremely active and have racing. They will show symptoms consistent with somebody who has major depression that doesn't have bipolar disorder, in the sense that they become clinically depressed, they feel bad, they become lethargic, they may be suicidal, they may have a lack of ability to feel a variety. Bipolar disorder is a cycling of those episodes. In between the episodes, people may function adequately without symptoms. Bipolar disorder, sooner or later, they're going to swing back into a mania or depression. The reason I gave him that diagnosis, from my opinion, was I thought that the records consistently mentioned that diagnosis, and that the description of symptoms appeared to be consistent with that diagnosis. He may have had psychotic episodes before. As I said, I didn't see any evidence of it when I interacted with him. He was when I interacted with him in a stable condition, and if he has bipolar disorder, he was in one of the periods in between where he was not either manic or severely depressed.
All right, but when someone's on one end of the spectrum or the other, it's fairly obvious that they're in a abnormal state, whether it's the mania state or whether it's the depressive state. It's fairly.
Yeah, it can be, depending upon how severe it is, but yes, I agree with you.
When was the last time the defendant ever, that you're aware of, from the records that you reviewed and your meeting with the defendant himself, when was the last time he ever exhibited any symptoms of bipolar disorder?
Well, they were, and he certainly appeared to have those symptoms during incarceration in DOC from the voluminous records I had there.
Okay, and how far back was it that he was incarcerated in the Department of Corrections?
Hold on just a moment. I believe that he was there from 2004 to 2008.
Between 2008 and 2013, was there any evidence, any records, any self-report by the defendant that he had ever suffered any symptoms of bipolar disorder?
Hold on just a moment. He told me that he would have manic episodes which would last several days, which occurred a few times a year, that he was having intermittent depression episodes, but that he has not sought treatment. But I don't have, to answer your question, I think where you're headed is I don't have any medical records of treatment between those periods of time.
Okay, so when was the last, when he got out of prison was 2008, I believe you said?
I believe that's correct.
And 2013 is when he was arrested for this charge. So for 5 years, there was no indication, any medical records, any treatment with regard to bipolar disorder. Is that right?
Yes, and that's not unusual to me.
The only evidence that we have of it, other than defendant's self-report, is when he has been incarcerated.
Of that particular diagnosis, I agree with you, yes.
Did you yourself, when you met with the defendant, did you ever see him in either one of those, any manic state or any majorly depressive state?
No. As I said before, when I saw him, he was calm. I saw him for an extensive period of time the first time, and at that point in time, he was not on medications. I saw him briefly again last week when he was on medications.
So the basis of your opinion with regard to bipolar is the fact that other doctors have essentially prescribed him medications that are to treat bipolar disorder, correct? Not your own observation.
No, his report of symptoms to me, not my observations at the moment. But yes, his report of symptoms to me and the medical records which I reviewed.
Okay, so his report of symptoms, the defendant's report of symptoms.
That's part of it, and the medical record. I mean, if he had told me that and I didn't have any medical records that reflected he had been treated for that, that would be a different issue. But I have medical records that show that he'd been treated with quite a wide variety of psychiatric medications.
Now, you indicated that you concluded that you believe that the defendant's capacity to conform his behavior to the constraints of the law was likely substantially impaired. Is that right?
Correct.
Is it your opinion that they were substantially impaired at the time that this crime was committed?
I think that they were impaired in general, and apparently in the time that this crime was committed, it was a highly affectively charged situation. But I was referring to a lifelong history of mental illness and seizure disorder dating back to childhood, which can impact a capacity to conform your behavior and to remain emotionally stable.
Okay, so are you talking about just simply a general impairment that's been with him throughout his life?
I think it has come and gone. I think it has been exacerbated during different periods of time of mental illness or situational stress. It's the result of the psychiatric illness and the neurological issue.
Did you talk to him about what was going through his mind at the time that all this occurred?
No, in these type of cases, unless I am very specifically told to address what happened, I do not do that. I talked to him in general about his condition over the course of his life. I didn't ask him what specifically happened. From my perspective, he, as a defendant, my understanding is he's maintaining his innocence. It is my assumption, for the purpose of my evaluation, that when we get to this point and when I wrote the report, it's my assumption that he's guilty, because that's where we are. And so I presume that to be the case.
So the bottom line is, at the time that these crimes were committed, you do not know if he was in a bipolar, manic or depressive state, or any other state of mind with regard to any of the mental disorders that you have described here today?
I only know that he documented an attempted suicide shortly after arrest and was treated with psychiatric medications very soon thereafter.
Okay, well, that wasn't my question. That was 3 days after the occurred.
Well, I understand that, but I'm just saying that that's the closest thing that I have to the time is the jail records.
Right, but my question is, at the time that these crimes were committed, you don't know what state he was in, correct?
No, I did not talk to him about specifically what happened.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, any redirect?
Dr. Mings, this issue of the malingering, you're not taking back your testimony based on the questions the state just asked you, correct?
No, absolutely not.
All right, and is it possible for a person, let's say 10 years ago, to go through some testing and perhaps at that time do some malingering, and then fast forward 15 years later, someone else does some testing and they're determined there wasn't any malingering at all? Is that possible?
Absolutely. And I tell people up front when I'm evaluating them that I'm concerned about whether they're going to be cooperative with me, and I'm going to do specific things, but I don't tell them what they are to determine if they're cooperative with me, and that if they are uncooperative, there's nothing I say that is going to be of any use. I tell that to everybody because I want them to know up front where I'm coming from. The other thing is, when we're talking about the malingering in 2002, the state hospital report, if you read it in its entirety, when they went through the competency questions with him and they determined that he was competent to proceed, there was no indication that I could see that he was feigning an ignorance of the system or those issues by the time they did their competency evaluation. So he was cooperative with the structured interview when they ultimately produced their report.
Is that what you were going to say earlier on cross when the state didn't let you finish your answer?
Yes.
That's something else. It was that?
That's what I wanted to address, yes.
Okay. And the state asked you all these head injuries or whatever were self-reported, but getting hit in the face with the hardball and going into immediate grand mal seizures, that's documented in the records, right?
Yes.
I don't have any other questions.
Thank you, Andy. Okay.
Judge, I have one other question before I sit down.
Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Mings, when you were initially being cross-examined by the state, they referenced a report, a malingering, maybe referenced as recently as 2013, and if it was said that way, I don't believe that would be correct. Are we talking about 2003 from those older reports or 2013?
Well, see, the thing is, I didn't have the report, so I don't know.
Okay, but do you remember that question?
I remember the question that said 2013, and I was surprised by that.
Okay. And would it be more consistent with the questions and your understanding of all the evidence? It should have been 2003.
I just don't know. I never had the report.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Anything else?
Yeah, just a quick question about the seizure disorders, Dr. Mings. Isn't it true that the defendant hasn't, from as far as you're aware, hasn't suffered from any seizures since he was approximately 13 years of age?
I'm unsure about that issue. That may be true.
Okay. Nothing further.
Thank you. Anything else?
You don't know one way or the other what his date of his last seizure was, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Anything else? All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and excuse you for the day. To return tomorrow at 9 a.m. Remind you not to talk about the case. Don't do any research on these matters. Don't talk to anyone, or don't allow anyone to talk to you about the case, okay? See you tomorrow. All right, jury's out. My intent to adjourn at this time.
Yeah, Judge, I got a witness on the wing. I guess he's going to have to stay tonight, correct?
Yeah. It's 4:30, so. All right, see you tomorrow.